The children were still drawing when the officers walked in. 30 of them, ages 6 to 11, sitting at low tables in classroom 4 of Marin Shelf Colony Post, drawing their home planet from memory with colored sticks and paper that had come in on the last supply run. They had never been to Earth. Most of them had never left the station. But they drew it anyway, the way children draw things they love before they understand what love costs. The drawings were wrong. Every one of them showed too much land, not enough ocean. The coastlines were guessed at, the mountain ranges placed wherever they felt right. The teacher, Sen Call, had been pinning them to the wall for 4 years. The wall was full. She did not correct them. That was the thing you noticed, if you were paying attention. Not the chalk dust, not the low hum of the station's recycled air. The fact that a trained educator looked at 30 geographically wrong drawings of Earth and pinned every single one up anyway. No red marks, no gentle corrections, just the drawing and a pin and the wall. 8 minutes before the officers walked in, the Convocation's Compliance Directorate had filed its enforcement action. 30 children. A human school inside Convocation-designated space. Resolution 8814, passed 11 days ago, reclassifying human colony schools as unlicensed ideological infrastructure. No notification had been sent to the schools. 31 years before that, humanity had started counting. Stay close, the document was already written. It had been for 4 years. The school had been open for 17 years. Marin Shelf Colony Post sat inside Convocation-designated space under a bilateral educational accord signed in 2291. The agreement was straightforward. Human outpost, human children, standard curriculum, the kind of arrangement that the Convocation processed by the thousands and never looked at again. Sen Call had been there for 4 of those 17 years. She had come from a teaching position on Callisto Station, applied for the post because it was harder to get to and paid slightly less, and had not regretted it once. Her students ranged from 6 to 11. They called her Teach, which she had not asked for and did not discourage. Every morning before first session, she laid out the colored drawing sticks on the tables. Every Friday, she asked the older students to draw something from home, their neighborhood, their family's quarters, the view from the window of wherever they had come from. And once a term, she asked everyone to draw Earth. They always drew it wrong. She pinned the drawings anyway. The wall behind her desk held 4 years of wrong Earths. Too much land. The continents stretched or compressed by memory and feeling. The oceans too small or colored the wrong shade or missing entirely in one corner where a 6-year-old had run out of blue. Sen had a geography overlay she could have projected. She kept it in her desk drawer. On the morning of the enforcement action, she was helping a boy named Eli with the shape of the Pacific when the door opened. 3 Vethon compliance officers came in without knocking. The first was very tall, 2 meters and more, with a bone-white shell that clicked faintly against the door frame as it passed through. It moved on floor contact pads and made almost no sound. The second was smaller, faster, carrying a narrow scan wand. It was already tapping the wand against its left forearm before it had cleared the entrance. Tap, pause, tap. The third stood in the back and said nothing. Sen stood up. The tall one, HFY, had already filed the compliance action from outside the building. It filed before it touched the door. The filing gave it standing. The standing gave it authority. The authority was what it used now, moving toward the center of the room without making eye contact with the children, who had stopped drawing and were watching. Sen stepped in front of her students. "I need to see the stamped enforcement order," she said. No stamped order, no explanation, no warning. HFY raised one segmented limb and spoke a 3-digit code into its recorder. The smaller one, Dothvel, moved to the side of the room and began scanning the wall of drawings. The third one, Woolreth, spoke for the first time, always in the passive voice, always attributing the action somewhere else. "The students are being processed under standard protocol," Woolreth said. "Temporary transit holding. The facility will be secured pending review." "These are children," Sen said. "They are 6 years old." Woolreth did not respond. It was already filing the secondary action. The children were moved into a transit holding bay 2 corridors from the school. Sen was taken separately to a different facility. The last thing she saw when they let her out was the wall, 30 wrong Earths, all of them still pinned up, all of them exactly where she had left them. The compliance officers did not take the drawings down. Director General Ossian Farrell was 63 years old, had spent 28 years in Galactic Treaty Administration, and had never once raised his voice in a professional setting. People who worked with him for the first time often mistook this for weakness. People who worked with him twice did not make that mistake again. He was in the Convocation's Grand Adjudication Hall when the notification reached him. Routine session, trade framework discussion, third reading of a corridor access amendment. The hall had 38-meter ceilings of pale mineral stone, and the human delegation platform was set 1.1 meters below the main floor. It had always been set that way. The architecture of the hall had always been the argument. Farrell read the notification on his device. He read it once. Then he folded it, lengthwise first, then across. One fold. He put it in his jacket pocket. He stood up from the platform and walked out of the session without speaking to anyone. No one in the hall saw anything significant in this. A man leaving a meeting early. It happened. 14 hours after the children were processed into transit holding. The vessel carrying them suffered what the Convocation's incident log would classify as an unforeseeable navigational systems failure. The vessel did not survive re-entry. All 30 children were lost. Eli, the boy who had been drawing the Pacific. He was 8 years old and liked animals. He had a drawing of a dog pinned above his bunk. The Convocation issued a statement the following morning. 2 sentences. Regrettable outcome. Full procedural review initiated. Sen Call read it in the separate facility where she was being held. She did not speak. She sat with her hands flat on the table in front of her. At the oral sublevel archive, 6 floors below Luna's administrative relay station, a team member logged the statement into the archive at 03:14 Earth Standard. It was the 1400th entry. The archive was in sublevel 6. No windows. Recycled air that had a faint plastic edge to it. One kettle on a shelf near the door that someone had brought in years ago and no one had ever moved. A single long table with 6 workstations, 4 of which were occupied at any given time, 2 of which had never been empty in 31 years as far as anyone could tell. Farrell arrived at 03:00. Commander Pavanov was at her desk running transit corridor status reports. She was 60 years old, had a posture that suggested she had never once slouched in her life, and did not look up when Farrell came in. She had a way of sitting that meant she already knew why you were there, and was waiting for you to figure out she knew. The kettle was boiling. Farrell sat down across from her. He did not take off his jacket. The statement, he said. Logged, Nove said, still not looking up. 31,400. Farrell was quiet for a moment. From somewhere down the corridor, a secondary system made a low cycling sound and went quiet again. Show me, he said. Nove pulled up the archive index on the center screen. It filled with entries. Each one was a line, a date, an article number, an accord name, a convocation action, a witness name. The lines went back 31 years. Some of the dates had multiple entries. Some had 40 or 50. The violations were everything. Corridor reclassifications that bypassed the transit accord, advisory resolutions that overrode the Observer Rights Compact, taxation structures that contradicted the Commercial Access Treaty. Everyone was documented. Everyone had a witness. Everyone had been logged, filed, and never once raised with the Convocation directly. Farrell read for a while. He already knew what was in it. He had been adding to it for 22 of the 31 years it had been running. How many do we use? He asked. Nove looked up for the first time. All of them, she said. Operation Drawn Quiet had been active for 31 years. It had not started as a plan with a name. It had started as a habit. A young treaty administrator named Pavanov, 30 years old, watching the Convocation pass a corridor reclassification that violated 3 articles of the Transit Accord, picking up a pen and writing it down. Date, article number, witnesses. She had kept a physical index at first, handwritten in a green notebook that she still had somewhere in a box. By the time she brought Farrell in 22 years ago, it was a team. 6 people total over the years, never more, never announced. Nove, the strategic lead. Dr. Orrin Cass, 46, chief archivist, the person who had built the indexing system that cross-referenced every violation to the specific article, and every article to every other accord that might also apply. Ussold Beck, 41, who had spent 19 years studying the Convocation's own Mutual Transit Accord, and knew its Clause 7 better than anyone who had written it. Captain Soravell, 54, who had spent those same 19 years doing something that looked like routine logistics work, and was actually the slow, quiet repositioning of human transit infrastructure into legally defensible controlling access on 14 key corridors. Davin Oss, 33, who spoke 9 non-human languages and had spent 6 years building relationships with species the Convocation considered too small to watch. And Admiral Narasoon, 69, who held the sole signatory authority for what they were building toward and had never once used it. It was not a military operation. There were no weapons. There was no fleet positioned anywhere. The operation was legal architecture, economic architecture. A document that was being built the way you build a wall, one brick, one entry, one witnessed violation at a time. Farrell kept a handwritten index too, not the archive, a personal one. Every promise he had watched being broken. Every accord he had helped negotiate that the Convocation had since treated as a suggestion. He had drafted 3 of the 9 accords that were now documented as violated in the archive. He had drafted them carefully. He had believed in them. He had also been paying attention. The declaration itself was 1,847 pages. It cited every violation in the archive by article number, by date, and by the name of the witness who had agreed in advance to be named. Every entry had been cross-referenced. The document was structured so that any challenge to one entry could be handled by 3 others that reached the same finding by a different route. It had been ready for 4 years. Farrell asked Nove why they had waited. She looked at the kettle. It had stopped boiling. The room was quiet. "We needed a reason that was so clear, so documented, so witnessed," she said, "that the Convocation would have no procedural language to argue with it, not just a strong case, an irrefutable one, something filed so cleanly that disputing it would require disputing their own records." She paused. "The children," she said, "the transport, that is the kind of reason that leaves no room for procedural language." Farrell was quiet. His jacket was still on. He had not touched the pocket where the notification was folded. "The coalition," he said, "how long?" Nove nodded at Davin Oss's empty workstation. "Oss started making contact 4 hours ago." Davin Oss had been awake for 22 hours by the time he reached the Dressy Collective. He had contacted the other 8 species first, working through the list he had built over 6 years, cross-referencing their own violation archives against the Convocation's standing resolutions, building the picture. Each species had its own record. Each had filed its own complaints with the Convocation. Each had received acknowledgement receipts. None had received a response. The Morvine Federacy had been waiting for consensus approval on a petition for 22 years. The Tharak Remnant, a dispersed people with no home system, living on mobile station clusters, had been keeping violation logs for longer than humanity had been in the Convocation at all. The Outer Pelanic Assembly had sent the same 3 complaints about the same 3 corridor violations for 22 years, and had 22 acknowledgement receipts to show for it. None of them had ever expected to be heard. Oss called the Dressy Collective last, not because they were least important, but because he knew Elder Sareth would be the hardest call and he needed to be ready for it. He was not ready for it. Sareth answered on the second signal. She was 220 years old, which for the Dressy placed her in the category of deeply settled, not old in the sense of diminished, but old in the sense of having watched long enough that very little surprised her. The collective communicated in layered meaning clusters rather than direct sentences, but Sareth had learned human standard decades ago because she had, at some point, decided it was worth the trouble. "We have been waiting," she said, "for someone to ask." She signed within 6 minutes. After that, the others came in order. The Morvine Federacy, famously slow to reach consensus, had apparently been in internal discussion already for 3 hours before Oss called, as if they had been waiting too. Their counter-signature arrived before the call was fully closed. The Tharak Remnant said almost nothing. Their representative pulled up their own archive on screen and said, "Ours goes back 80 years further than yours. We would like it included." The Outer Pelanic Assembly signed in 40 seconds. By the time Oss reached the last of the 9, he had been awake for 26 hours. He sat back in his chair, in his small office 2 corridors from the archive, and looked at 9 counter-signature commitments on his screen. 9 species the Convocation had never thought to watch. 9 archives of violations. 9 voices that alone would have been dismissed. Together, they were the filing. Ussold Beck activated the economic suspension at 04:30 Earth Standard. The activation itself took 11 seconds. A sequence of filings, each one pulling from the legal architecture that Beck had spent 19 years building. The instrument was Clause 7 of the Mutual Transit Accord, which the Convocation had written and signed, and apparently never read past Clause 4. Clause 7 permitted unilateral corridor closure during an active treaty dispute. The language was their own. Beck had found it in the original document 23 years ago and had not mentioned it to anyone outside the team. Humanity had held controlling access to 14 key transit corridors for 19 years. Captain Vell had spent 19 years making that happen through what looked, from the outside, like routine logistics work. Repositioning relay stations, renewing maintenance contracts, upgrading docking infrastructure in places that happened to sit at the intersection of major shipping lanes. The corridors had never been militarized. They had never needed to be. No one had thought to ask why the maintenance contracts kept getting renewed. The suspension did not fire immediately. It was queued, waiting for the declaration to transmit. It would activate the moment the filing was received and logged. Admiral Nara soon arrived at the archive at 05:30. She was 69 years old. She had a grandson who had been 8 years old. He had liked animals. He had been drawing the Pacific. Nobody in the room said this. They did not need to. Soon sat at the table and read the final page of the declaration. She read it slowly. She had read it before, twice in the last 4 years, during the 2 times they had come close to filing and had pulled back. She read it again now. She asked for a glass of water. Cass got her one. She read the last paragraph. Then she signed. She capped the stylus and set it on the table in front of her. She did not speak. She left the stylus where it was. The declaration was signed at 05:58 Earth Standard. Farrell stood near the wall. He had his hand in his jacket pocket. The folded notification was there. He did not take it out. He had folded it once hours ago in the hall, and that fold meant he intended to use it, and now it had been used or would be in 2 minutes. He was not sure what he would do with it afterward. The transmission was queued. At 06:00 Earth Standard, it would go to every Convocation member species simultaneously. Every galactic news relay, every human outpost across 14 star systems. The counter-signatures were attached. The Clause 7 filing was queued behind it. At 05:59, Farrell checked the clock. He looked at Nove. She looked back at him. "You could stay and watch," she said. "No," he said. He picked up his jacket. "I filed the document. That was the job." He left the archive at 05:59. 30 seconds later, at 06:00, the transmission fired. 31 years, 1 document, and a team of 6. The Convocation had 31,400 opportunities to make it unnecessary. It used none of them. The transmission fired at 06:00 Earth Standard, and the Convocation's Grand Adjudication Hall received it at 06:01. That 1-minute gap mattered. It meant the session was already running. It meant 3 Vethon administrators were mid-sentence on a trade framework amendment when their screens updated. It meant there was no clean moment to prepare, no procedural pause to gather language. The declaration simply arrived, the way a door arrives when someone finally uses the lock. The hall was large, 38 meters of pale mineral ceiling, tiered seating for 61 species, most of them present. The human delegation platform sat 1.1 meters below the main floor, as it always had. Empty. The delegation was not there. Nobody had noticed that yet. The first wave was the declaration itself. 1,847 pages, 31,400 violations, 9 active accords, each one cited by its full name and the year it was signed. Every violation listed by article number, by date, and by the name of the witness who had agreed in advance to be named. The document was organized so that every challenge to one entry led to 3 others that reached the same finding by a different route. The Vethon clerk at the session's recording station read the incoming header once. She read it again. The chemical she secreted when certain S-Revon species, all of them, had a faint, sharp edge to it, like something between metal and resin. It reached the tier above her before she had finished reading the second line. Nobody in the hall said anything. The session chair, a Morvine administrator, bioluminescent patches on his forearms cycling in a pattern that suggested he was trying to stay calm, raised one hand to call for procedural pause. The motion was logged. The log now sat inside an active treaty dispute filing. The pause was noted. The noting was also logged. Everything they did was being logged into their own system now. The document kept arriving, page after page, section after section. In the hall you could hear the sound of screens updating, a low series of tones, one after another, each one the same pitch, patient and unvarying, the way a clock sounds when you have nowhere to be. The second wave hit before the hall had finished processing the first. Sareth's countersignature arrived as a separate transmission, logged into the Convocation's receipt system 6 seconds after the declaration itself. The system noted it, filed it, applied it to the active dispute record. Then the Morvine Federacy, then the Tharak Remnant, then 6 more, one after another, each transmission arriving before the previous one had been fully read, each one logged by the same system that had spent decades logging the Coalition's complaints and sending back acknowledgement receipts with no action attached. The same system, the same protocol, their own tools. By the time the 9th countersignature was received, the Convocation's own archive had a fully witnessed, fully documented 9-species coalition filing active under the Foundational Compact's dispute resolution framework. A framework the Convocation had written. A framework it had apparently not read past the part it liked. Dothvel was in the hall. It had been reassigned from Marin Shelf for a routine follow-up. It sat in the observation tier with its scan wand across its knees. It was tapping the wand against its forearm. Once. Pause. Tap. The rhythm it always kept between actions, the stress stell it did not know it had. Then it stopped. Once, twice, 3 times. It stopped mid-tap and did not start again. The hall noticed, not loudly. Just a small shift in attention, the way a room shifts when something that has always been moving goes still. Dothvel sat with the wand flat across its knees, and its forearm was motionless. And for the first time in the time anyone in that hall had watched it work, it did not seem to know what its next action was. A Vethon proceduralist in the tier above tried to file an objection. She filed it cleanly, inside the system, with the correct article cited. The system received it. The system logged it. The system noted that the objection had been filed during an active treaty dispute and attached it to the dispute record under Clause 7 sub-protocol. The objection was now part of the record. She filed the objection, and the filing became evidence. The third wave was quieter than the first 2. That was the part that was hardest to process. Transit corridor access requests began returning a status. Not a block, not a military hold. A status filed under the Convocation's own mutual transit accord, citing the exact clause and subarticle that permitted it. 14 corridors. The corridors that moved about 60% of the Convocation's commercial transit volume through the outer systems. The corridors that humanity had been maintaining, upgrading, and quietly holding controlling access to for 19 years, through what had looked like routine logistics work. No fleet, no soldiers, no act of war. The corridors were not blocked by force. They were closed by filing. Every suspension notice cited the Convocation's own language back at itself, clause by clause, and the language was accurate, and the language was legal, and there was nothing in the rulebook for this because the rulebook had been written assuming no one else would ever read it that carefully. In the hall, the bioluminescent patches on the session chair's forearms had stopped cycling entirely. They were dark. That meant something for his species. Nobody in the hall from his species was going to explain what. The fourth wave was the empty seat. Someone finally noticed it formally. A Vethon clerk doing her job called for the human delegation to respond to the filing. The call went out. No response. The delegation platform was empty, had been empty since the session started. The clerk called again, following procedure, because the procedure said to call twice. No response. The declaration's final paragraph was read into the record by a different clerk, because someone had to do it. His voice was flat, the way Vethon voices went when they were filing something they could not contextualize. The paragraph stated that the human delegation did not recognize the Convocation's jurisdiction during the period of treaty dissolution and would not be present for proceedings conducted under a framework it had formally exited. That was the fourth wave. The fifth was smaller. A single transmission, pre-recorded, arriving at the hall's public address system through a standard broadcast channel that anyone with a Convocation membership code could access. No insignia. No backdrop, a plain room with plain light. A man 63 years old, sitting very still in a jacket with no markings. He was not in the hall. He had filed the document and left. Ossian Farrell looked at the camera and spoke. The Convocation has had 31 years of receipts, he said. We have filed them all. The corridors are closed under your own clause. The counter-signatures are in your own system. The violations are documented by article, by date, and by the name of witnesses who agreed to be named. There is nothing here that is not your own language. He paused. We simply learned to use it. The hall did not erupt. It did not shout. It did not call for emergency response or summon the enforcement directorate or demand a counterfiling. It went quiet. Not the quiet of shock, the quiet of an institution that has run out of procedural language. The kind of quiet that lands when the thing being done to you is being done with tools you built, in a language you wrote, under rules you created on the assumption that no one small enough to ignore would ever learn to read them. Every species in the hall knew the documentation was solid. Not probably solid. Not strong enough to debate. Solid the way 31 years of time-stamped, witnessed, cross-referenced entries are solid. The kind of solid that has no procedural gap to exploit because it was built by people who knew where every gap was. Every species in the hall knew 9 co-signatories meant this was not a human action. It was a coalition action. 9 species the Convocation had classified as observer tier, peripheral, not worth watching. 9 archives. 9 sets of unanswered receipts. 9 voices that had each been ignored for decades and had used that time to document every instance of being ignored. The cascade was complete. All 5 waves, all of them legal, all of them filed. The doors humanity had used were closed. They had been built to be closed. It had just taken 31 years to finish the lock. Somewhere in the Convocation's own archive system, the 31,400 receipts were permanently attached. They could not be deleted. They could not be reclassified. They had been filed under the Convocation's own dispute protocol, and the protocol did not have a removal function, because no one who wrote the protocol had imagined needing one. A Convocation archivist doing her job tried to query them. The system responded normally. All records present, all records accessible. She sat with her hands on the desk and stared at the query result for a while. The emergency session was called for 0814. Humanity's seat was empty. The session was conducted entirely in the passive voice. 3 weeks later, in a small room on Earth, Commander Pavanov read 30 names aloud. No gallery, no broadcast, no cameras. The 6 members of the team were present. Sen Call sat in the front row. She had been released 11 days after the declaration filed, when the Convocation's legal team quietly determined that her continued detention had no standing under the active dispute framework. She had not asked for an apology. She had not received one. Nov read slowly. She did not change her voice between names. She did not editorialize. She said each name once clearly and moved to the next. The room was quiet between names the way a room is quiet when people are listening and not just waiting. We did not count because we were afraid. We did not count because we were angry. We counted because we wanted what we filed to be the kind of thing no one could argue with, not them, not anyone, not ever. When Nov reached the last name, she closed the page. She set it on the table. She did not speak again. In the months that followed, the Convocation did not dissolve. Its lights stayed on. Its sessions continued. The passive voice persisted in its official communications, which was the only visible change at the administrative level. But 6 of its member species, reading the archive, reviewing the 31,400 entries, going back through decades of their own standing resolutions with new context, began filing procedural reviews, quietly, without announcement. 1 species at a time, then 2 at once, then a third that had not been part of the coalition but had been watching. The process was slow, it was institutional, it was entirely undramatic and would take years. The Convocation's structure did not break. What it meant to be a member of it had changed, and that change would take a long time to work through every standing agreement, and every archived resolution, and every procedural assumption that had been built on the idea that the smaller species were not paying attention. They had been paying attention. They had been paying attention for a very long time. Sen Call's new classroom was in a school on Earth, ground level, windows, real sunlight coming in at an angle in the afternoons, which was something she had not had at Marin Shelf. The children here had seen Earth. Most of them had stood outside and looked up at it, or driven through it, or pressed their faces against a window and watched it from above on approach. They knew what it looked like. She still asked them to draw it. They still drew it wrong. Too much land. The coastlines bent in directions they did not go. The oceans too small, or the wrong shade of blue, or missing a corner because a 7-year-old had pressed too hard with the green and run out of room. The geography overlay was in her desk drawer. It had always been in her desk drawer. She pinned every drawing to the wall. Davin Os found Elder Sareth on the relay station at the edge of what used to be Corridor 12's main approach lane. The corridor was still suspended. The space where the transit lanes had run was quiet now. No shipping signals, no docking requests, just open dark with the faint background light of a system that was still there and still running. They sat by the observation window for a while without talking. Sareth had a way of being quiet that felt like she was still listening to something. Was it worth it? She said finally. It was not quite a question. 31 years of counting. Os did not answer right away. He watched the corridor space. A relay buoy blinked at the edge of the lane, its signal going out into nothing, patient and unvarying, the way a clock sounds when you have nowhere to be. We didn't count because we were afraid to act, he said. We counted because we wanted what we filed to be the kind of thing that couldn't be argued with. Not by them, not by anyone, not ever. Sareth looked at the dark. The dressy have a word, she said, for the kind of patience that builds something instead of waiting for something. We have used it for 200 years without a good example to give. She did not say what the word was. She did not need to. On Earth, in a classroom with afternoon light coming through the windows, 30 new drawings were going up on the wall. Too much land, not enough ocean. Coastlines guessed at from love rather than memory. The relay buoy at the edge of Corridor 12 blinked once into the quiet dark. In the Convocation's archive, 31,400 receipts sat in their folders, attached to their violations, filed under their own protocol. The lights in the hall were still on,